Welcome to the Classroom Café, where it's all about brewing the conversation between fellow educators. This special presentation is brought to you by the United Federation of Teachers and the union's Member Assistance Program. Thank you for joining us today. We hope this podcast inspires you, nourishes you, and motivates you. Now let's get started. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Classroom Café. I'm Selma Williams, and with us today, as usual, is our co-host, Janice Acosta.
Hi, everyone. I'm Janice Acosta, Clinical Coordinator here at the UFT Member Assistance Program.
And today we have a special guest with us. I mean, all of our guests are special, but today this one is dear to our heart and dear to the Member Assistance Program. We have Dr. Julie Beidl. Julie has been a school social worker for the DOE for a decade. And most recently, she has come on board as a MAP PM clinician. And we are so happy to have you today, Julie.
I'm so excited to be here. I have been looking forward to this for so long. So I can't believe the day is finally here. I'm excited. Thank you for having me.
Yay!
We love having you here, Julie. Today, we're going to discuss one of the clinical trends that Julie has been seeing throughout her experience over the years. So I want to take the time to really introduce this topic because it's something that not many people have heard of or discussed, even as clinicians. It's something that's very new to us, right? And it's the concept or the idea of highly sensitive people. And yes, I know everybody's mind is going the same place, like highly sensitive, right? That's like everyone you meet on the street these days, myself included. So I want to give the expert a little bit of time, Julie, to just talk about how you got into this, what began this search or this quest to, kind of study highly sensitive people.
Or better yet, Julie, why don't we start off with understanding what is a highly sensitive person? What does that even mean?
Sure. So a highly sensitive person or a highly sensitive child, because children eventually grow up to be adults, and this is a trait that you are born with. It's a personality trait, and it is comprised of four really main categories. Different theorists have different kind of angles to this, but the main categories are depth of processing, overstimulation or easy overstimulation, emotional responsiveness, and sensitive to subtle stimuli. So throughout our conversation, we're going to get more into what that means. But to kind of go back to Selma's original question, I think you asked how I found myself here or what sparked my interest. And I think as we go on, what an HSP is will become clearer. And what became clear for me was during the pandemic, I knew I was a highly sensitive person, but I didn't have much context other than just knowing this about myself. And so I started seeing a therapist who specialized with highly sensitive people, and she started contextualizing all my experiences in this HSP trait, which I must say for a little while was kind of annoying because I wanted her to, solve all my problems. And she's like, well, that's just how highly sensitive people are. And I'm like, no, there has to be an answer. So it was, she just kept grounding me, and that's okay. You're highly sensitive. That's okay. You have to give yourself permission to XYZ. That's okay if you need to take a break. So it helped me to put up boundaries. It helped me to understand where some of my emotional reactions were coming from, especially with this isolation and this increase in stress. And really what interested me in how it manifested in the school setting was when we came back in person. I was getting all of these parent requests for evaluations. I'm a school-based support team social worker. So that means that my job is to assess students with the school psychologist together, she and I, and then also the related service professionals, so OTs, PTs, speech and language pathologists. We assess students for eligibility for special education, which means they have to fit a disability classification. So we had all of these parents really expressing a lot of concern about their students their children coming back to school and not achieving academically what they knew they were capable of achieving. And we would evaluate these kids and they would not be eligible. There was nothing cognitively, that would explain their challenges in academics or socially. There was nothing, there wasn't even a disparity academically, like what a second grader should be doing versus what they are doing. There wasn't really anything to explain this. And so the more I kind of contextualized my own experience with what was happening with these kids, I started to see a lot of similarities, and these requests for evals just kept popping up, and they are not eligible for special education. So I still have to answer the referral concern. What do we do with these students?
Mm.
And a lot of it was this kind of lack of skill development that I noticed, probably because of the pandemic, that, kids during school times, they, experiment with the risk of, if I raise my hand, is everybody going to look at me and think I'm stupid? Or if I ask to go to the bathroom, to take this just small mental break, are people going to watch me as I exit the door? And highly sensitive kids, because this sensing the subtle, when we go back to the S, sensing the subtle, they are hyper aware, more than your average person, of what's going on in their environment. They're hyper aware of what other people are doing and thinking, and they often, one of the things is they seem to read your mind sometimes, and that is because they are masters at picking up subtleties in facial expressions. And sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes the facial expression is I don't understand this math question, and you think it's, wow, I can't believe that person just asked to go to the bathroom. So there's this kind of like self-blame that kids put on themselves. And because of that lack of experimenting with raising their hand, lack of, it was easy on Zoom to like type your teacher a question rather than raise your hand. So you didn't experiment with what it felt like to confront that anxiety and have it go okay. So I was seeing a lot of these kids really fit the highly sensitive profile. And after these conversations with parents, we often found that, one or both parents were too, and the pandemic affected them as well. So that's kind of what sparked my interest in all of this. I really wanted to support those kids and figure out a way to, they weren't eligible for special education, but what can we do? Having conversations with teachers, having conversations with administrators and parents, and seeing these kids supported just looked different.
Mm. This is so interesting. I have so many questions floating around in my brain right now because you're touching on things that, right, like anyone at any time can experience. And I can't imagine, or I guess I can't imagine feeling that daily or minutely especially as a child in a school setting when everything is already big and scary. To have to be struggling with this and not be able to put a name to it, not be able to advocate for yourself or know how, right? So you explained what it isn't, right? It's not a disability, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't qualify you for certain services. So what is it? How can, you get support, and what does that look like?
So oftentimes as adults or as children, it does show up as anxiety, particularly if you are in an environment or multiple environments that doesn't understand your, particular version of sensitivity. So going back to kind of how we all started, it's really defined by 4 major areas. Depth of processing. So you're a deep thinker, it's the kid or the adult that really takes time to process what's being said to them, time to think about things. Maybe it's the kid who a week later will bring up something that you talked about last week and you're like, wow, we haven't talked about that in a week. And it's because that processing is still happening in their brains. There are cognitive studies where they've seen the actual brain activity in HSP is far longer than the average person. So you see an image of something, the HSP brain is processing it many, many minutes well after the average person. So the HSP brain is often very overloaded with these bits of information that we're trying to process that sometimes our brain just is not capable of processing with more information coming at it. So that kind of leads us to number 2, the overstimulation. So sometimes that can be sensory overstimulation. Sometimes it can be cognitive overstimulation. Sometimes this can even look like ADHD or autism because of all of the things happening in the sensory system that the brain is trying to process at once. And the HSP brain tries very hard to process all these things, and sometimes it's just not capable. So if you were raised in a really loud environment and you're kind of the quiet person, I'm thinking about what that looks like in a classroom, in an ICT classroom where there's 2 teachers and kids being pulled in and out in small groups, and you as the instructor, maybe you're a highly sensitive person, what that looks like to your nervous system, which is much more finely tuned. There's a book for kids that I love, Rico the Race Car, and it kind of describes that the HSP body is like, like a Ferrari, like a finely tuned Ferrari. You can't just take a Ferrari out on a, highway with potholes. It's gonna feel every pothole, right? But a Mack truck, which is also purposeful and so important in our society, is able to do that. And so they just have different functions. It's not better, it's not worse, it's just different functions. And so when you put both of those cars in the same environment, how are those individual people going to respond to that environment? And sometimes, depending on the home environment, the school environment, that might be seen as a positive and negative. You might be punished for it, you might be misunderstood, you might be thriving because you're in a family of artists. So it really depends on, that overstimulation depends on your environment. And the third one, emotional responsiveness. So they tend to be very empathetic. They tend to kind of know what others need before the other person knows what they need. They're problem solvers. They're good communicators. They're able to kind of see what's wrong between somebody and help solve problems. Again, these are all, depending on your environment. These can be nurtured, or they can be they can come out in ways that maybe are not so pro-social. And then the last one, sensitivity to subtle stimuli. So that goes back again to the sensory, being attuned to your environment, knowing, like if something is moved, if your day looks different than what you expected it to, that flexibility sometimes can be impacted. So that's kind of the overarching 4 categories. And there is a self-assessment consisting of 27 questions that kind of goes deep into all of these areas, which you guys took. And I'm so excited to hear about your answers and where you fell on the highly sensitive scale.
So I scored an 11.
Okay. Oh, I was going to ask if there were anything in particular. So 14 is the cutoff. So there are 26 questions. So 14 is the cutoff. That doesn't mean that you're not necessarily highly sensitive. Sometimes it means that you need more familiarity with the questions. You could take this a year later and find yourself higher or lower. So this is just kind of your baseline assessment. So what are some of the things that stuck out to you?
I think one of the things that stuck out to me the most, and this is one of the things that I was like, when I got my score of 11, I was like, oh, I thought it was going to be higher than that, because I do consider myself to be someone who's like attuned to other people. Like after the work week, people are like, what are you doing this weekend? I'm like, I'm doing nothing. I'm spending my weekend at home. Someone can attest to this. I'm spending my weekend at home. I don't want to talk to anyone. I don't want to do anything. Like that is my time to just like completely decompress. And so I think those were the two things that stuck out to me the most.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, again, this is your first entry into the world of HSP. And so, for me, that time with the therapist, my score at the very beginning was very different from my score now. When I understood what it meant to notice subtleties, people pointing things out in me, and I would just constantly go back and contextualize it. And oh, that's an HSP trait. I'm not weird. Like that's an HSP trait.
Yeah.
And I started to understand the questions differently, and actually do some research too on the questions, and do a lot of research and like brain scans and like peer-reviewed studies, and look into all of that. So I think the more familiarity you have with the topic and with the questions, the more you understand how it shows up for you in your body. So we'll come back in a year and we'll see what it's like.
Yeah.
It could be. Selma, what about you?
So I scored a whopping 23.
Wow.
Yeah. As Janice was kind of surprised that hers was so low, and I kind of knew I had a lot of highly sensitive like traits. I didn't expect it to be this high. Yeah, so it was very much like eye-opening for me, like just how overstimulated I am by noises and sounds and even like lights, and when things are going off around me, it really begins to dysregulate me. And I kind of am glad that I stumbled upon this assessment and that you shared this with us, because it kind of also got me thinking about my kids and how this shows up in them, or could potentially show up in them. So this was like really, really gold. This was a great tool for me. And I guess, what I never thought about as being a highly sensitive trait would be like avoiding violent or like um, what's the word?
Yeah.
Suspenseful TV shows. Like
Yeah.
those, I avoid them altogether. Like I will go to the end of a movie to get the happy ending just so that I know it exists and that I know I can watch it. But other than that, it's very, very anxiety provoking for me. So that was like, wow, I didn't even think that's something that could be a trait.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and I even go to the point where, it's full self disclosure. I am a highly sensitive person, as we've already discussed. Um, you know, I even go to the point where watching inspiring movies is just really draining for me. I love it, but
Mm,
but if somebody wants to watch an inspiring movie and I'm like, I can't emotionally go there right now. Like I don't have the
yeah.
bandwidth to
Mm.
be inspired. So it goes for graphic or violent. A lot of people, this shows up as seeing people or animals get hurt. That
Mhm.
deep empathy, going back to the DOES, that deep
Yeah.
empathy and the
Yeah.
emotional responsiveness. It is as if we are feeling that pain, and it's not exactly, but the emotional regulation piece of this also shows up, right? So it depends on your environment growing up. If you were shut down emotionally, maybe you do have a better ability to watch violent movies and TV shows because you have a lot of exposure to it and you weren't allowed to be sad or empathic, or maybe it was something you could override. There are so many influencing, confounding factors to all of these elements that it doesn't show up the same for every single person, and it doesn't show up the same in my body every single day. You talked about
Mhm.
the sensory sensitivity. There are times in my office where I feel like I am sitting on the face of the sun. It is so bright. And then there are other days where, like it's totally fine and I don't even notice. Some of that has to do with how good was my sleep? How calm was my weekend? Did I have a
Mhm.
really frazzled commute that morning? So even thinking about our kids too, like, if we think of District 75 programs, a lot of those kids get bused into the city, or they take
Mhm.
an hour-long train ride into the city. And what is that train ride like? What's that bus ride like? Is it super crowded? Is it hot? Is the AC working? Is it loud?
Mhm.
Is that kid the kid that has to plug their ears when the ambulance goes by or when the train goes by? So all of these things, it's cumulative. So we it is so important, Janice, to go back to your point about, after a long week, needing that deprivation,
Mhm.
almost like not, sometimes that self-care is not doing a thing. Sometimes it's not going to a party when,
Mhm.
you just had field day and your kids were hopped up on sugar.
Yeah.
And, you were making sure that nobody like broke a limb and hyper vigilant all day making sure that
Mhm.
everybody had fun, and then you go home to your family and your kids need something, and so how what does even self-care look like for
Yeah.
highly sensitive people? And sometimes it's
Mhm.
adding things, sometimes it's adding beauty, and sometimes it's that beauty can be exhausting
Yeah.
depending on our mood, and we need to take away and we need to deprive our sensory system of stimulation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like that. And I immediately go to moms or the primary parent, right? Because it doesn't always have to be the mom,
Right.
but the
Mhm.
primary parent who is planning the things, who are making doctor's appointments and all the things and making sure they get
Mhm.
what they need to get, um, feeling guilty for being highly sensitive, right? Like needing some time away from these things and people that you love and enjoy, but the guilt that comes with having to take that time for self. especially as a mom, you're expected, right, to be quote unquote selfless. And I think what I'm hearing is that you're making it okay for parents to take a sabbatical from their children and their spouse and whoever is in the home with them, if they're in the blended family, and just really remove themselves from things that might be overstimulating to be able to come back and be their best selves.
Yeah, it's not only okay, but it's necessary. But as we know, as you know, we are mental health clinicians. So as we know, with every change in a boundary, that change has to be communicated to the people that love us and that
Mhm.
we love. You know, we can't just change a boundary and say, bye, I'm not going to your soccer game today. You know, we have conversations, age appropriate conversations with our kids. We have conversations with our spouses. We have conversations with our siblings and the people that we love and that love us about hey, I heard this really amazing podcast and I think I might be highly sensitive. Take this
Yeah.
assessment with me.
Mhm.
And exploring that together and having conversations with your kids. Like right now, I love you so much and I can tell that you're getting really frustrated. But my nervous system needs to take a breather. Why don't you calm down your nervous system and help me calm down my nervous system? Let's breathe together. And you teach your kid what is a nervous system. And these are all part of co-regulation practices anyway, practices that we know that help us bond with our kids. So when you model good self-care, which means taking
Mhm.
care of our bodies and being attuned to how our bodies respond to various stimuli, we're teaching that to our kids. And how many times are we in classroom settings or as therapists do we work with kids and the kids say, I don't know why I did that. I just all of a sudden did it. All of a sudden the desk was turned over and I couldn't help it. So like when we have those conversations about our own bodies, we are modeling for kids what it looks like to take care of themselves and to understand what's going on in their nervous system and in their body. And it gives them language, it gives them feeling language, it gives them sensory language, to even bring that into the classroom when they're struggling.
Yeah.
Mhm. So now that we have all of this information, right, about, well, new information about highly sensitive individuals, if I were interested, where do I start? Where do I go to just find out if I'm highly sensitive, right? And to begin that journey.
Sure. So, I think the first step is to take that self-report assessment. You can find it, Dr. Elaine Aron. She's really one of the pioneers and really the most sustaining pioneer of this research. She's got tons of articles and books, and she created a self-report measure. You can find it at hsperson.com, highly sensitive hsperson.com/test. And there's a self-assessment and then there's a test that you can take for little ones that are in your life. Again, becoming familiar with what is actually the question asking is important. So as you first take this test, you might start thinking about the questions later, like, oh, I said no to this, but actually maybe this is a bit of a yes, and you
Mhm.
self-monitor. So knowing about yourself, knowing your hot spots, knowing the times where you are stressed, just knowing just in general, when humans are stressed, we are not always our best selves. And
Mhm.
that is certainly the case for HSPs. When we're stressed, HSPs oftentimes are very affected by things like hunger and thirst, or interoception, we call it. So the things that are going on inside of our bodies manifest emotionally, behaviorally. So first of all, just knowing our bodies is really important, and communicating that to people that we love. That it's important for me when I come home. It's important for me when I go change out of my day clothes, just to have 30 seconds to breathe. That's super important to me. And communicating those needs from your spouse or your kids.
Mhm.
Not that kids will necessarily honor that, but again, we go back to kind of co-regulating with them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, we're all therapists here, so we're kind of biased. But do you think that it's necessary, once you've discovered that you might be highly sensitive or have a lot of these traits, to begin to seek out therapists that are versed in this type of uh, population?
Hmm.
Absolutely. I wish there were more therapists that specialized in this. There are not a lot of therapists that specialize in this, but there are definitely resources that we can, attach to this podcast. I think about letters communicating to your therapist what it means to be highly sensitive and how that shows up for you as a particular being. And I think it's the job of the person who's seeking out therapy to work with their therapist to figure out what they want out of therapy. And the context, the backdrop of having a highly sensitive personality trait is so important to, one, be understood by your therapist, and two, to kind of develop some coping mechanisms or some self-care strategies. So self-care for a highly sensitive person could be, going to a museum. It could be, very unique to your nervous system. It could be, Denise, in the podcast, you talked about a bath, that sensory experience of the water and the sensory experience of the warmth. And so knowing those things, your therapist knowing those things about you, and collectively you can come up with some things that one, are helpful for self-care, but also contextualizing your life experiences, going back to your child and, finally getting the answer of like, why did I cry so much? Why was I always in trouble for, like talking in class? Or, there are highly sensitive people, they go deep with other human beings. And so that might mean going to a party is really overwhelming, but if you know one person, you go deep with that one person at a party. Not thinking you're a freak. I had a client one time say, "Is this why I felt so different my whole life?" So having that context with a therapist of what it is to be highly sensitive is so important, and you can discover that together with your therapist.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful.
Absolutely.
So, Julie, I know that in schools, a lot of what we're seeing is ADHD, ASD diagnoses. Is there any overlap with highly sensitive people, and can we have them at the same time? Or do you think that we might be overdiagnosing ADHD when it could in fact be um, a highly sensitive person not diagnosis. The person could just be highly sensitive, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, so I definitely think that requires a professional who is familiar with all three. But I can say that there are things about being highly sensitive that sometimes appear to be ADHD or ASD. The sensory sensitivities. So for instance, there's a particular shirt that I love. On days that I know I'm gonna have a stressful day, I know I can't wear that shirt because it's gonna bother me. The neckline is too high. So if you're a kid, that could look, if a parent is like hypervigilant and, like trying to look for answers about what's going on with their kid, they might stumble across ASD and be like, oh, they have so many sensory sensitivities, they must be ASD. And that's not necessarily the case. The same with ADHD. If you think about how our brains are processing, HSP brains are processing that much data, if you are teaching me math, which I care absolutely 0% about, and I'm thinking about, the argument at recess, or the anchor chart on the wall that's different, or, the person who dropped their pencil. If I'm thinking about all those things, I am not mentally present for that math lesson, which one shows up academically when it's time to, do my math homework or do the work in school. But two, it looks like inattentiveness. It could look like hyperactivity if I haven't had enough movement, if my body needs to move that day and I'm sitting in a straight chair and I don't have, flexible seating options. It could look like aggressiveness at recess with others. It could look like hyperactivity. It could look like my body taking a very long time after gym, which is loud, the cacophony of noise in a gym, to come back to the classroom, maybe especially if gym is after recess and lunch. My body could be so overstimulated that as a little person, I don't know what to do with all of that energy. And so maybe that means taking a mindful minute. Maybe that means incorporating things in your classroom, having them come back from recess and having the lights off and the music calm, Maybe it looks like, it's the similar strategies that you would use with ADHD and ASD. And sometimes those small modifications to the environment can really transform a kid's nervous system, and make them available for learning. And so sometimes the fit of the classroom, the fit of the home environment creates what looks like ASD or ADHD, but it really does take a trained professional to assess those things in every unique case. Um, but it's certainly something to consider.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is the perfect time for this podcast, right? To begin to think about these things while, where most students are out of school, and to really take the time to get armed with the information that you need going back into the school year for how you do best, for ways that you can regulate your nervous system and advocate for yourself, right? As students and educators alike, whatever setting you're in. I could see this being helpful for people who are working in hospitals, which can be very, very busy,
Yeah.
overstimulating settings. Like, this is a
Mm-hmm.
great time to really take a moment and think about what works, begin to, identify professionals that can help you identify that. I think this is a perfect time to explore, get outside and see what now that the weather's a little nicer, what in nature we can use as supports, how we can use our senses. So I think this is perfect timing to begin to assess all of these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and really
Yeah.
take the time to look at it and think about it and reflect on it, right? I think one of the things that you said, Julie, is that like it's important to know your body and to know what's going on in your body, how you're feeling, and just what things are coming up. And so, right, this is a good time to start to really get familiar with that.
Yeah, and I think it's always easier to do slow things when there's less activity going on around you. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you are highly sensitive, it's hard to do meditation. It's hard to sit still because your nervous system is on overload and active, and our kind of society tells us produce and
Mhm.
do. And sometimes self-care can feel anti-American. It can feel like
Yeah.
I'm being lazy, or especially if you grew up in an environment where taking time for yourself was considered selfish. uh,
Mm-hmm.
so having the summer where maybe there are less responsibilities, not for everybody, but especially if you have kids, but different responsibilities, maybe, sometimes that shift in things that we do from day to day can give us new perspective on the old things that we do, and our routines and our habits. And even thinking in September, when we go back into the classroom, what do I want my classroom to look like? What do I want my OT room to look like? What do I want my
Mhm.
speech and language room to look like? How do I set it up so that it's I'm the best educator I can be. I'm the
Mhm.
best school professional I can be. What are the things that I need to learn about my own nervous system that allow me to show up for my students in the way that is most supportive for them and for us collectively?
I was going to say, I even think about the time of year we're in right now when everyone's planning for vacation and how that can be overstimulating for a highly sensitive
Totally.
person. In our society now, vacation has become a chore. Vacation has
Yeah.
become go to the most exotic place that takes you 9 days to get there, have an itinerary that looks so wonderful in pictures. And then when you come back, you're completely exhausted because you had to do all the things in this
Mm-hmm.
foreign place. And it wasn't your body doesn't even recognize it was on a break. You know, we've kind of like robbed the whole point of a vacation or a siesta or a time to just be. I think it's something that we're missing in this country in particular.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. And even just change in general can sometimes be really hard for a highly sensitive person. Highly sensitive
Mhm.
people do tend towards anxiety, and so not everybody, certainly, but if you are on the anxious side, having predictability is really important. And at a vacation, predictability is not exactly always available to us. So sometimes that itinerary is really helpful, and sometimes it's too much. And having that itinerary and saying, what, I got to build in time just to appreciate the beauty and
Yeah.
sit at a cafe, or listen to, some calming, soothing music, or begin my day with meditation, or I'm just grounding myself in like what I'm looking for this day, knowing my limitations. My best friend and I traveled together, and we developed this, like 1 to 10 system, where it's, like I'm right now at a 5. Let's go. Let's see this next cathedral. But if she's at a 7, I'm like, okay, I know that we probably need like food or water. Like 7 is too close for comfort. So like let's take a break. Let's go back to the hotel. Let's take a snack. Whatever we need to do to get you down back to like a 2 or 3 or 4 where we're like ready to go. So that's been really helpful for us. But vacation is a lot of unpredictable things, a lot of things going wrong, a lot of things going really, really right. And that being so fun that, our nervous system is just really hyped up. And we got to come back to reality, come back to our regular lives, and now deal with that like huge gap between what was amazing and now, maybe something we're not super looking forward to. So building in that time to regulate ourselves before going back into our daily lives can be really important and necessary, and keep us from, resenting everything about our lives.
Yeah.
Julie, thank you so much for being here and for taking the time to share with us all the incredible knowledge that you have on the highly sensitive person, and encouraging us to reflect inward, and also to just look at the little people in our lives, understand them a little bit differently in a way that is more empathic. So thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
I, for one, have been completely edified by this podcast. And I'm beginning to look at myself and the people around me in a different light. I'm definitely going to be taking advantage of the resources that you've given us, and we're going to make sure that they're in the show notes for everyone, so that you also can take advantage of the assessments and the various resources that Julie has provided. So I want to say thank you again, Julie. You have truly and richly blessed us today.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for having me. It really was a pleasure to be here. And thank you to all of the listeners for listening.
Once again, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Classroom Café. If you are a UFT member, the Members Assistance Program can be reached at 212-701-9620 or at mapinfo@uft.org.